This is a Fox News alert. Police are searching for clues to explain the mass shooting yesterday in Parkland, Florida. Expelled high school student Nicholas Cruz apparently murdered 17 people. That's the allegation, including teachers and students, before being captured off campus by police. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. We want to give you a quick update on the latest in the shooting investigations. We're going to go to Fox Chief National Correspondent Ed Henry, who is in South Florida tonight. Hey, Ed.
Tucker, good to see you. An affidavit out new tonight from the Broward County Sheriff shows, in fact, that the suspect told the police that he was the shooter, basically confessing to this, what everybody already knew. And I can tell you, yes, that death toll still stands at 17, far too high, but there were a lot of people here on the ground who thought it might climb some more because of the carnage they were seeing yesterday. And but for the fact that you had a remarkable number of people at the hospital behind me who worked through the night on people who were going through surgery in critical condition, and they basically saved their lives. And for the first time, we talked to those doctors today to tell us about what it was like when they called that code green, all hands on deck, to deal with patient after patient, as we're also getting harrowing experiences from students inside that high school. Listen.
We kept on getting phone calls. Are you ready to receive more patients? Are you ready to take this one? Are you ready to take that one?
I'm still scared. Like I just have that image, like that sound of the gunshots right in my head. Like I just hear it like constantly.
He stopped us, and he got us into Chef Kurth with Chef Kurth's help into her classroom. I would say about 30 to 40 students into this teacher's classroom at the same time. And as a result of their heroic actions, they saved probably all of our lives, about 40 of us.
Listen to that last student talking about a janitor, an unsung hero in all of this, who realized that when the shooter pulled the fire alarm, there were about 40 barricaded students, as you heard there, who then rushed right towards the shooter. They didn't realize it at first. The janitor told them to turn around. They went into another room. They went to safety. They believe 40 more could have been killed. Again, 17, far too many. But I can tell you a glimmer of hope tonight, Tucker, which is that despite all of the patients last night who were in critical condition here, tonight there's only one in critical condition, and they're hopeful that it will soon be zero and that everyone will be getting out and going home very soon. Tucker.
Ed Henry for us in Florida. Thanks a lot, Ed. A decent person is horrified by what happened yesterday in Parkland. Every thoughtful person knows something horrible is going on in American society. Tragedies like this happen for a reason, and it probably doesn't have a lot to do with guns. The percentage of American households with firearms has dropped dramatically over the past 35 years. Meanwhile, the number of mass shootings has risen. If you're over 40, you did not grow up in a country like this. So the question is, what happened? It could be a lot of things. Far more Americans than ever before take psychiatric medications. Are outbursts of violence a potential side effect? We don't know, but it's possible. Does the social atomization of modern society play a role in all this? Well, spending life online does cause alienation. We know that. Last week, we interviewed author Johann Hari, who has studied the dramatic rise of depression in this country. As he pointed out, the most common answer to the question, how many close friends do you have, is now zero. The lack of meaningful relationships does cause despair. Perhaps in rare cases, it drives some to mass murder. Meanwhile, the nuclear family has collapsed nationwide. Does a generation of boys growing up without fathers pose a threat to this country? Of course it does. Why wouldn't it? Fatherlessness is one feature common to many mass shooters. Nobody's surprised by that. And what about men more broadly? As a group, men are not thriving in this country right now. Ignore the propaganda, and there's a lot of it, and instead look at the numbers. Men kill themselves more, graduate less, and of course commit pretty much 100% of mass shootings. It's a disaster, which for some reason our elites persist in ignoring. In March, this show will begin a month-long series every Wednesday on what is happening to men. We hope it'll be interesting. But why haven't we been talking about this for years? Now, we're not saying any of these factors caused the massacre we saw yesterday. We don't know that. We are saying we ought to do our honest best as a nation to figure out what exactly is going on here. But we're not doing that. That vital conversation has been drowned out and made impossible by mindless screeching about gun control, led by blustery charlatans in the media, you know exactly who they are, and also in Congress, whose only real agenda is moral preening. They aren't trying to solve the problem. Their aims are darker than that. Press a little bit and you'll see it. Sensible gun reforms, you hear that phrase a lot. You heard it all day today on cable news. What exactly does that mean, sensible gun reforms? Banning bump stocks? No. A piece on Vox.com today calls for a landmark gun control bill like the one Australia passed 22 years ago in 1996. That's the law that liberals are always telling you about. But the Australian law wasn't gun control, and it wasn't a voluntary buyback, no matter what they tell you. It was gun confiscation, a wholesale mandatory disarmament of the entire civilian population. Imagine what would happen if you tried that here in this country. America is not Australia for a bunch of reasons, including our history and our Bill of Rights. Imagine federal officials marching from house to house, seizing hundreds of millions of firearms from law-abiding citizens, and then fining and imprisoning those who resist. Vox approvingly calls this leadership. In fact, it's a recipe for bloodshed and civil war. It's nuts. Yet it is a common fantasy on the left. Dan Pfeiffer was a senior advisor to Barack Obama. Now he's a contributor at CNN, of course. Last fall, Pfeiffer wrote an article attacking his fellow Democrats for what he bluntly called fake moderation on guns. His advice was this: stop pretending to respect the Constitution and instead focusing on appointing judges who will nullify it. The goal? Gun seizures, ammunition regulation, the disarmament of the American population, a country where only the people in charge have guns and everybody else obeys. In the wake of yesterday's shooting, Pfeiffer's piece is going viral on the left. What he wrote is what they believe. So let's stop lying about this. The calls you're hearing today for gun control have nothing to do with protecting Americans from violence. What you're witnessing is a kind of class war. The left hates rural America, red America, gun-owning America, the America that elected Donald Trump. They hate them. Progressives are still in charge of most of the major institutions in this country, and they despise the autonomy of an armed population. They want collective punishment for the sins of a few. They seek to obliterate a core constitutional right rather than trying to mitigate its downsides. They call it gun control, but it's not. It's people control. For the left, voters who can't be controlled can't be trusted. So why have we seen such a massive increase, what seems like one, in shootings like this? Tom Kirsting is a psychotherapist and school counselor. Judge Alex Farrar is a former Miami-Dade County judge, and they both join us tonight. Judge, to you first, we're going to find out a lot more in this specific case because unusually the shooter is still alive. But more broadly, we have seen in absolute terms a pretty big spike in shootings like this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, it'd be very difficult to just go ahead and jump into the mind of these shooters and come up with a very simple explanation for why they're behaving that way. Clearly, society has changed in its relationship with violence. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, there was nowhere near the level of violence we have today. We certainly had guns back then, but we didn't have the level of violence we have today. So I think in some ways, society has become very desensitized to violence. And I did see back then as a police officer, parents taking a much more key role in educating their kids about right and wrong. We seem to have lost that line of distinction between right and wrong. Not to say that that clearly applies to this case, because nobody would ever think that it's right to do this horrific act. But I think, like Mayor Giuliani discussed, it's the little things that lead to the big things. And as a judge, I used to tell the parents who come in my courtroom, you can either discipline your child now, or somebody like me is going to be disciplining them much later. And that discipline is going to be a lot harder to deal with because it is a rolling stone. And once it starts moving, you know, culture does change. And we see culture now being very violent, very, I would say, desensitized to it, where it doesn't faze them anymore.
Clearly. I mean, Tom, guns are not magic. They're tools. They don't operate themselves. Attitudes are what matter, and attitudes have changed. How have they changed, do you think?
Well, here's what I think, Tucker, right? So the society we live in is not the society I lived in growing up as a kid. This generation is being raised by social media and smartphones, and they're not spending enough time part of the family dynamic. And the kind of content, we see it. I mean, if you go on social media, whether it's just, you know, the hatred from, you know, people's views and so forth, we see this anger and this hatred that's occurring, that's getting into people's minds. That takes somebody who's mentally ill, like the shooter, okay? Imagine him absorbing hours and hours a day of video content, which is what I would presume he did, and I think we're going to see that. I really believe that. And imagine what that's doing to his mind, all right? Our actions as human beings are a reflection of what's spinning around upstairs in our minds. So we've got to get back to the basics of families. Parents need to sit down with their kids every night, get back to the dinner table, and have what the president said today, deep, meaningful interactions with one another.
I think that sounds right. Judge, why isn't there a national conversation about this? It seems like something that's important, and it's an obvious problem, and people feel like there's something deeply wrong with the culture that would produce something like this, but there isn't a conversation about it. Why?
I don't think it's something you can control. I think it's a lot harder to get people to change the way they're living their lives than it is to say, you know, if we just banned this type of gun, this problem would go away. And the reality is that if somebody is a homicidal maniac, if somebody is, and I completely agree with the doctor, that the sentiment out there gets created, especially in social media where there's so much hatred in today's day and age, it becomes a triggering effect. At some point, somebody snaps. So if somebody snaps and they want to kill a lot of children because they think, you know what, I'm going to become infamous, you don't need a gun to do that. Just sitting here talking to you, I can think of 3 ways right now that I could kill a lot of children if I was a homicidal maniac, and none of them would involve guns. So it's an easy answer. It's easy to say, let's ban guns and we've solved the problem, or let's ban this type of gun, because I don't think the U.S. will ever, having been founded with the Wild West, having been founded with guns, would ever get rid of all their guns. It's easy to say that. It's a lot harder to get people to change their behavior in the way that they are raising their children, and especially the way society's been kind of moving away from religion, which, like it or not, did set moral parameters for people and teach right and wrong. The other answer is a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree with that. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thanks, Tucker.
Thank you.
The Parkland shooting appears to have happened despite some advance warning. It turns out 5 months ago the FBI was tipped off in a way that a YouTube commenter was discussing his intent to be a professional school shooter.
And how did the FBI respond?
They responded pretty immediately. I had a field agent contact me and meet me at my office the very next morning, and unfortunately I wasn't able to provide them with much.
Well, you gave them the user's name, right, which is the same exact name as the shooter.
I'm sure had more time and effort been put into finding out who the username belongs to, if that's even possible. I don't know how many Nicholas Cruzes there are on YouTube, but they would have been able to find out who this person was.
But as you heard, the FBI was not able to identify Cruz.
In 2017, the FBI received information about a comment made on a YouTube channel. The comment simply said, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." No other information was included with that comment, which would indicate a time, location, or the true identity of the person who made the comment. The FBI conducted database reviews, checks, but was unable to further identify the person who actually made the comment.
Ron Hosko is a former FBI assistant director here in Washington, and he joins us tonight. Ron, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
What happened here, do you think?
You know, I think that at first blush, I think the FBI worked within its guidelines. The FBI is bound by a document. It's about this thick. It's known as the Dialogue. They take that Bible very seriously, and it's really a document that's meant to limit the power of the FBI, keep them from excess, and that guides when the circumstances in which they can open a case, the techniques that they can use in pursuing a case, very often when they must close a case. So we've heard that conversation with some terrorism cases that have been closed and then somebody strikes. We saw it in Boston and other places around the country. That document is intended to protect the organization, is intended to protect you and I from FBI excesses.
So in this specific case, how did that prevent the FBI from moving forward?
Well, I suspect what happened here is, as they're working within their guidelines, there's a couple levels of cases that they can work. The lowest level of that is essentially, it's called an assessment. I have very little information to start. I do not have enough predication to start a preliminary inquiry or a full investigation and use all the FBI's tools. I have very little. The guidance of the Dialogue also does this. The FBI is a federal investigative agency. Its focus is on the federal law. That Dialogue is pointing them towards federal crimes and national security threats. And here, on its face, you may have neither of those two things. you have some words that some would say, that's freedom of speech.
Right.
I'm not threatening somebody directly. I'm just throwing up some hate supposition on the internet and walking away from it, stirring people up.
That's a totally fair point. I wonder, we've been pretty tough on the FBI recently on this show, and I think in a way that's warranted. But I also think in cases like this, are we vesting too much confidence in all of our law enforcement that they can prevent people bent on mass murder from committing it? That seems like a lot to ask.
Well, that is a lot to ask. First, I think law enforcement absolutely has to try to connect up.
Yeah.
And here, I do think the FBI probably owes us a little bit more clarity on what steps they took. However, if I don't like something you say on this show, and I'm sitting at the FBI, and you've been critical of them recently, they don't get to start a case on Tucker.
Well, that's right.
And start following him, because one of those things of an authorized purpose is it can't be for protected First Amendment rights.
Now, I'm sorry, you a minute ago referenced DIAG, just for...
The DIAG, right.
DIAG. Can you just tell us what that's... Is that an acronym? What is that?
It is the FBI's investigative and operational guide.
Okay, so it's the handbook.
It's the handbook. It's this thick.
All right.
Everyone is tested on it. They get lectures on it from internal legal teams. They adhere to that. It's audited. Their conduct is audited. There's somebody looking over their shoulder to say you did this right, or you were outside of the bounds on this. And First Amendment protected speech is one of those key areas that the DIAG talks about repeatedly. And so they may have had an authorized purpose to start an assessment, but they can use very few tools. And what Rob Lasky referred to right there is open source. They can do database checks, other government agency database checks, or open source. And that's about it. This is not the type of case where you're going to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, give me a stack of subpoenas, I'm going to start chasing.
So if somebody says, I may become a professional school shooter, who knows what it means, but if he said, I'm going to shoot up this school on this date, presumably the FBI...
Now you have a better starting point, right? Okay. But here, if I'm listening to those words, and I've had this experience, one of my first questions is on its face, is this prosecutable? Will the U.S. Attorney's Office take this? The answer is no.
No, it is no. Yeah, it's a shame. Ron, thank you for that explanation.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it. The left is using yesterday's tragedy as a pretext for disarming the population. No surprises there. Up next, we'll meet someone who thinks that's a good idea. Stay tuned. Well, as is now well-established tradition, a mass shooting quickly provokes calls for aggressive new gun control from Democratic politicians.
I believe in the Constitution, but no right is absolute, and common sense measures consistent with the Second Amendment are absolutely acceptable under our laws.
In states and communities that have looser and laxer gun laws, there are more gun crimes committed.
I have said over and over, I'd rather pass gun safety legislation than win the election.
Ethan Behrman is a California radio show host, and he joins us. Now, Ethan, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks, Tucker.
So the 1996 Australian example is something that liberals often mention. We said at the top of the show that Dan Pfeiffer, the assistant to President Obama and now a CNN talker, wrote a piece several months ago going around today about how that's a model for this country, the gun buyback, which was mandatory, so gun confiscation. So there are hundreds of millions of firearms in the United States. What do you think would happen if liberal dreams came true and federal agents tried to confiscate hundreds of millions of privately owned weapons in this country?
That's not the right approach. And by the way, I don't actually agree with the Australian example. I use Germany, Finland, and Switzerland as the examples, and even Israel for that matter, which is where they have psychological background exams before you're issued the license to have your firearm. Switzerland has half as many firearms as we do, but they have 0 school shootings. Why is that? And they even have semi-automatic rifles. So the question becomes, what are we doing to make sure people who shouldn't have firearms don't have firearms? And that is where we need to be addressing laws.
I wonder though,
let's be honest, Tucker.
It's interesting. I mean, there are so many, and the Swiss example is a great one. It's a very high percentage of gun ownership there. The government actually encourages people to have weapons at home, as in effect a militia. But you have very few mass shootings, and in fact, very little crime. I'm wondering why there are no calls from the left to ask real questions about American culture, and does the collapse of family structure millennia-old family structure has maybe something to do with this, or the fact that, you know, a quarter of the population's on psychotropic drugs, or obvious things. Why does no liberal ever mention those? It's always about taking my firearms away. Why is that, I wonder?
Well, I mean, there is something to be to what you're saying, but let's talk about it from a bigger picture then. If you're going to go down that route, there were significant changes that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, not just affecting the family, but also in terms of consumption of drugs that are actually prescribed by doctors for children.
That's what I'm saying.
We have
That's
things
exactly
like social
what I'm talking
media.
about. I agree completely.
Yeah.
So, but what's so interesting is look, and I don't know the answer to this. I'm not a social scientist, but I've lived here almost 50 years, and I've seen how the country has changed. Guns are tools. You can do with them a lot of different things. They don't shoot themselves. It's silly. I mean, honestly, though, and we've had semi-automatic weapons for both of our lifetimes, and they haven't been misused like this. So why is this willful blindness to obvious causes and instead blaming the tool? That makes me suspicious. Can you see why?
Well, I can, but I want to disagree with you on something. Why would you give somebody, let's say, that doesn't know how to hammer a nail, give them an automatic nail gun, and so they're going to accidentally shoot themselves with that? That's the same idea here with 100-round magazines. Bump stocks are absolutely meaningless and useless things that are just done to circumvent automatic weapons laws. Okay, there are common sense things that we can do to minimize the damage, Tucker, minimize it.
It's not real. Look, it's not real. There's one crime ever that I'm aware of ever in the United States in our history that was committed with the bump stock. I don't have any emotional attachment to bump stocks. They're stupid. They destroy your accuracy, whatever.
Right.
But that's so far from the actual point, which is what's going on to our society that would cause a 19-year-old boy to shoot his former classmates. Why does no one ask that question? And all these cable news demagogues, you know, I care more than you do. But nobody asks the real questions. Why? What is this anyway? Talk about avoidance.
Well, I know there are a couple of issues. This is actually a very complicated topic, and one of them is we have to change our laws regarding mental health care and getting people that you and I have talked about before, and it relates to homelessness that you brought up before.
I agree.
Mental health care is a crisis in this country. But then the Republicans want to cut. The Trump budget wants to cut over $1 trillion out of Medicaid and Medicare.
So the Democrats close the mental hospitals. Okay, you can have the partisan debate, but I don't even care about that. I'm a father of 4. I care about the country. I want to have a real. I don't want to be infantilized with this dumb crap about, oh, the fact that you have a deer rifle makes me less safe. That's a lie, and everyone knows it. Why are young men doing this? Maybe it's, I don't know why, but again, why do we not have that conversation? Why are we pretending it's not real?
But because there's a two-part conversation, and you and I, interestingly enough, agree on the mental health problem that we're having. But on the second side, until we resolve that, why make it easy for them to mow down 17 lives in moments?
Because actually, I know a lot about this. I don't think that you do. The truth is, you're not allowed.
I do. I've fired AR-15s before, Tucker.
No, but the law around it. If you're adjudicated mentally ill, you cannot buy a gun. No one who has been adjudicated mentally ill, to my knowledge, in a mass shooting has been able to buy a gun. The system, as it stands, works. What do you? Do you see what I'm saying?
No, it doesn't. So the teachers knew there was a problem with this kid, and no, our mental health laws are broken. They knew there was something wrong. Teachers know who are the problem, and we're not empowering them to do something about it.
So it's really simple. Then let's be very specific in a very short amount of time. A teacher notices a kid is weird, possibly menacing. Does that mean
get him counseling?
I'm not against that, but does that mean he loses his right to buy a gun as an adult? I mean, what's the answer?
And we do need to change. Yes.
If a teacher thinks you're weird, he can take away a constitutional right. I'm not arguing against it.
Once the psychologist or psychiatrist has seen you, yes.
So
once
if you're
the psychologist or psychiatrist has seen
that's already the law, Ethan. That's what I don't understand. That's already the law. You should know that, right?
So we need to bridge the gap. We need to bridge the gap, Tucker. And in the meantime,
what does that mean?
I've actually called for Governor Brown here in California to call up the National Guard, station 2 National Guards people at every single school until we are able to resolve this.
Okay, that's just putting a Band-Aid on a bloody wound. But thank you, Ethan. I appreciate it, and I hope we can talk more about this. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tucker.
Former FBI Director Jim Comey told lawmakers the FBI did not think that Mike Flynn lied to them. Huh? Flynn, by the way, could be heading to prison having pleaded guilty to lying. What is going on? What is the heart of the Russia scandal? Weirder by the moment. Byron York joins us next. From the beginning, former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn has been at the center of the Russian collusion conspiracy theory. During the transition, the story goes, you've heard it a lot, Flynn talked to Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak and then lied about what they talked about. apparently proving the existence of a vast Russian takeover of the government. That's what you see on CNN. That's the basic account. Is it actually true? Byron York of the Washington Examiner has been looking carefully, and he reports that in March of 2017, then FBI Director Jim Comey told Congress he did not believe that Flynn lied to investigators about his call with Kislyak. Instead, he said any false statements by Flynn were accidental. And yet, as we said, Flynn pleaded guilty to a felony for lying about that exact thing. What happened? Byron York in studio with us tonight. Byron, this is really confusing.
It is confusing. Go back to January of last year. I mean, the papers were filled with talk about Trump and Russia. Actually, they still are.
Yes.
But they were talking about Trump and Russia and Michael Flynn and these conversations that he had in December during the transition with the Russians. So on January 24th, on a basis that a lot of Republicans are very skeptical about, the FBI goes into the White House and discusses with Michael Flynn what went on in these calls. Now, there was a lot more news after that. Remember,
with no lawyer present. This was
with no lawyer present. That was Flynn's decision. Remember, there was a lot of Republican unhappiness because the substance of that conversation, which had been the Flynn-Kislyak conversation, which had been wiretapped because we wiretapped the Russian ambassador, had been leaked to the press. So Republicans were upset about that. They demanded that the FBI director, James Comey, come up to Capitol Hill and answer some questions. And they were surprised when Comey told them that the two FBI agents who had interviewed Flynn didn't think he lied to them. And if he said anything inaccurate to them, that it was not intentional. So they took the impression, these lawmakers took the impression that, well, I guess Flynn is not going to be charged in this case. And then fast forward to December 1, he pleads guilty to doing just that, lying in that particular meeting.
Which doesn't make any sense at all. So that suggests that Mueller had a different interpretation of it, and somehow convinced, or Flynn was convinced, to plead to something that Comey said he didn't do in the first place. Do you have any idea what the explanation for that could be?
Well, the big change, of course, was that President Trump fired James Comey.
Right.
And as a result of that, Robert Mueller was appointed the special counsel. He assembled a team of very aggressive prosecutors, and all of a sudden Michael Flynn is back in it. It's not clear, did they have more on Flynn, that they pressured him to do this? But you have to remember, what Flynn pled guilty to was something that all the parties knew on that day in January, because this conversation had been wiretapped. There was a recording of it, a transcript of it. And so when the
But that doesn't make sense either, because Flynn was the former head of an intelligence agency.
Yes. Well, everyone thinks he surely knew that he had been recorded.
He must have done. That's what he did for a living for years, right? So of course he would know that that conversation was wiretapped. So why would he lie? How could he have lied about that?
It was kind of odd in the first place. The FBI asking, well, what did you say to the Russian ambassador, when they in fact knew exactly what he said to the Russian ambassador. And he knew that they knew, yes.
Okay. We don't know what the answer is here, but clearly this is very odd, and I look forward to the day when we
No, and the case, by the way, is not completely over. There have been a few developments in the last few weeks of a new judge in the Flynn case ordering the Mueller office to produce evidence to Flynn, which is kind of an unusual situation in the sense that he has already pleaded guilty.
Right, and that's
so that case is not really over yet.
Ahead of time.
Yeah.
Wow, Byron York, amazing. Thank you for staying on this.
Thank you.
President Trump's tax bill gave badly needed tax relief to much of the middle class. Now the administration is considering offsetting that with a big hike to the gas tax aimed squarely at rural America. We'll discuss one of the president's more baffling policy proposals next. Well, the Trump administration just signed a significant tax cut for a lot of the middle class, but now there are calls to claw a lot of it back. Some in the administration are pushing for a major spend on infrastructure to be financed with a hike in the gas tax, the federal gas tax. That, of course, would fall heaviest on rural Americans, while leaving most of the wealthy urbanites who voted for Hillary untouched. It's a little puzzling. Peter Marisi is an economist and University of Maryland business professor, and he joins us tonight. Peter, great to see you.
Nice to see you.
So I know the gas tax is something that academics love because it seems, it's tidy, it's a user fee, it seems fair. But you sort of wonder if it is fair, because really the people who pay it are not the ones who benefited from our current economic structure. They're the people who have benefited least or who've suffered under it, who live in rural America?
Well, it's people that use the roads. The alternative is tolls. I mean, the federal government's only willing to put about $200 billion into this $1.5 trillion infrastructure program. So the question is, where is the rest of the money going to come from? What the states have been doing is basically selling roads to the private sector who put on whopping tolls.
But wait a second, that's the alternative? So why do we have government? Is it to like run diversity seminars and, you know, pay the retirement of federal employees? No, it's to defend the borders, to keep the Visigoths at bay, and to pave the roads. Like that's a core function of government. So when did that become like an extra add-on? Like a, do you know what I mean?
Hold on, we're on the
like
same
a cocktail
page.
On an airplane flight.
We're on the same page. I mean, I would love to carve all the deadbeats out of the entitlements program and pay for it that way. You know, 1 out of 20 Americans are adults. Are on Social Security disability. I can't believe that 1 out of 20 adults between 16 and 65 can't work. But the Obama administration's strategy for keeping unemployment down was to basically give everybody a disability pension.
Wait, but can we just, and look,
but I'm saying that's where we get the money from.
I'm just saying, can we start at the beginning, which is that paving the roads is not just a core function, is maybe the core function, going back to Rome, of a government. And now they're telling us, well, we're either going to sell it to some private equity group that's going to, you know, shaft you, or we're going to, you know, make rural America pay more. It's just, where do we get to these choices?
Well, it's as old as the country. You know, back in the early days of the Republic, the towns and villages couldn't put roads up, so they would have small syndicates of farmers and artisans who'd pay for the roads because they wanted to get their products to the market, and then they'd charge tolls. So we had the turnpike period. By the way, they all went bust, and a lot of the turnpikes that we have now are going bust, including 2 that Mr. Pence established.
Well, so, I mean, but if you work backwards from first principles, here's what you get to. If we were to pass this 25-cent increase, that would instantly eliminate about 60% of the benefit that middle America got from this tax cut.
Well, it's ridiculous to go 25 cents. The gas tax right now is 18.4. Since it was last raised in 1993, we've had about 67% inflation, about 2/3. So if you raised it by 12 cents, you'd be keeping up with inflation. That would be much more reasonable. But, you know, a lot of the gas tax is wasted. Let's forget about all the deadbeats on welfare. For example, they take some of that money for mass transit in New York or in Washington. And whenever you do that, all they do is increase civil servant salaries.
Of course.
They use it for bike paths, beautification, things of that nature.
No, but so if this were...
And then there's Davis-Bacon.
No, I couldn't agree. I'm with you on all of that stuff. But for some reason, the Chamber of Commerce is pushing this gas tax stuff. And you sort of wonder, like, so who uses the roads? Well, one of the biggest users of the roads is one of the biggest companies in the world, whose owner is the richest man in human history, Jeff Bezos of Amazon. You know what they paid in federal tax last year? Let me just do the math in my head. Oh, nothing. Nothing. According to reports, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, Amazon paid nothing. And yet, a lot of the, you know, that's their business, is using the roads. So why can't we just assess Amazon for this instead of assessing everyone in rural Maine and Nebraska?
Well, I don't think you'd quite get away with that, because I think you'd find that Amazon is very capable of lobbying.
Yes, you would.
Yeah, I think that's right. My feeling is there's a lot of inequities in the tax structure. For example, the carried interest. We all heard about how Mr. Trump was going to get rid of the carried interest. He said so when he was running for president. But unfortunately, Cohn, Mnuchin, and Trump benefit a great deal from it. So somehow or other it got left out of tax reform. And those guys continue to pay very low rates on their income. There are a lot of inequities in the system. We could certainly pay for the roads by cleaning up entitlements, by getting some of the still privileged loopholes out of the tax system. But unfortunately, that ain't on. And so they talk about a gas tax. I like a gas tax better than, for example, tolls and things of that nature.
Of course, selling public property to private companies. They did that with ticket collection here in D.C., and it's been a complete disaster. Well, they did it with parking meters in Chicago, same thing. But again, that shouldn't be our choice. But just really quick, 3 steps back. If this goes through, the Chamber of Commerce gets its way, and rural America has to pay the bills for Amazon, no federal taxes last year. Do you think people start to think, I'm getting the wrong end of the stick?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons it's so difficult to pass an increase in the gas tax, and that's why it hasn't gone up in over 2 decades, is simply because it is unfair that there are so many people in this country that are terribly wealthy that don't pay a whole lot of tax.
Yeah, and like all the MSNBC hosts who ride their bicycles in from Brooklyn, they're not going to pay a single dime in this.
You know, maybe we'd have a bicycle tire tax. How about that one? You know, $3 a tire.
If you're riding your fixed gear in from Brooklyn, you're going to have to pay double. That's my rule. Peter, great to see you.
Take care.
Thank you. Well, it's not just politicians who were irresponsible at yesterday's shooting. Celebrities went completely over the top. Not surprisingly, Mark Stein's been paying attention. He joins us next. Various celebrities were quick to give their vacuous opinions on national gun policy in the wake of the Parkland shooting, of course. Famed constitutional law scholar Chelsea Handler tweeted this, quote, "We have to elect candidates that are not funded by the NRA in November. We have an opportunity to elect candidates who won't allow kids to go to school and get shot. It's disgusting how many times this has happened, and Republicans do nothing. You all have blood on your hands," she said in measured tones. Meanwhile, elder statesman Kim Kardashian West tweeted this, quote, "We owe it to our children and our teachers to keep them safe while at school. Prayers won't do this, action will. Congress, please do your job. Protect Americans from senseless gun violence." That was written by a publicist, you can tell. And there are a lot of other tweets in that same vein. Author and columnist Mark Stein specializes in celebrity tweets. Indeed, he's compiling a book on the subject, we hope, and he joins us tonight. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Tucker. Good to be with you.
So what do you make of the response to this?
Well, you know, at a certain level, I understand these idiotic tweets because the defining act of these school shootings is the absence of meaning. I mean, if you compare it with, say, that ISIS guy on the bike path in New York who mowed down a bunch of people because he wants to usher in a new caliphate worldwide, in a sense, when you're doing it for Allah, that's easier to understand than these completely empty purposeless events where a guy just kills a bunch of school kids for no reason at all. And in that vacuum where we search for meaning, people pour their lamest, dreariest tropes. And so to blame it on the NRA is the default position of most celebrities and most Democrats, and that's what they do. But it's precisely because there is an absence of meaning in this event. It's precisely because a guy kills 17 people for no reason whatsoever. They did nothing to him. That suggests what you said at the top of the show, that the reasons for it are deeper, more complex, and it behooves us, in memory of the dead, to actually talk and think seriously about it.
I agree with that. It's a very deep observation, though, about the hollowness at the core of these things. What do you think, and I don't know, you don't want to speculate, no responsible person does, but you've watched years of this. What's your instinct about some of the causes of it?
Well, for example, I mean, I think it is much... You talked about social atomization at the top of the show, Tucker, and that's true. But the fact is that the combination of factors means you can be socially entirely dysfunctional and actually have a what seems like a rich and rewarding fantasy life through technology now. You know, if you're in the late 19th century, if you were a miserable social loser, you were basically just on your own kicking a can around the backyard. There was nothing else to do. Now, like this guy, you can go on the internet, you can make threats that attract the attention of the FBI, apparently. You can lead a rewarding life, communicating with some guy in Uzbekistan or Papua New Guinea, all over the world. And in some sense, that fantasy life is more real for people than actually, you know, going to the soda fountain and having a chocolate malt with friends or whatever they were doing 50, 60 or years ago. And that's very disturbing. The fact that the void is now rewarding and fulfilling, there is great peril in that, because it suggests we're going to have more of these kind of people in the years ahead.
The effects of technology, we have not paused long enough to consider what they are, but I suspect you're absolutely right. This is one of them. Mark Stein, thank you for that. Really interesting.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
President Trump is starting a shadow war with Russia in Syria. Surely that proves he's not Putin's puppet, or is that just what Putin wants us to think? That story next.